Good afternoon, everyone, and happy spring. Welcome to the second program in our new mental wellness series. Today's topic, coping with loneliness and social isolation. The Chicago Council on Science and Technology has a mission to enhance the public's understanding of science and technology and their impact on society. C2ST has spent the last 14 years working towards its mission of engaging the community and the public with science. If you would like to ask questions today during the program, you can go to c2st2.cnf.io and pose your questions there. You may also ask questions on our Facebook live stream or at YouTube, and our staff will bring those questions into the queue. If you'd like to learn more about C2ST or perhaps donate to foster curiosity, you can go to c2st.org and learn more there. So today we are going to feature two speakers, one highlighting the research on lonely brains, and the other will share coping strategies with us. We'll take approximately 20 minutes to hear our first speaker, and then approximately 20 minutes for our second speaker, and then end the program with a live Q&A. So please feel free to ask your questions. c2st2.cnf.io. Our first speaker, Dr. Livia Tomova, is a Henslow College Research Fellow at the Hughes Hall at the University of Cambridge in the UK. She investigates how stress, loneliness, and social isolation affect the brain and mind, especially during adolescence. At Cambridge, she works to identify the brain markers that predict or show vulnerable adverse effects of isolation and loneliness in teens and adolescents. And she works with Sarah Jane Blakemore there. She's also interested in investigating whether and how social media can fulfill social needs. So without further ado, let's hear from our first expert, Dr. Tomova. I turn it over to you.
Yeah, Dawn, thanks so much. Thanks for the nice introduction. So I'll go ahead and start my slideshow now. All right. I hope you can see that. If someone could give me like some sign or say something if not, otherwise I'll get started. All right, so I'll be speaking today about my research on the effects of loneliness and isolation on the brain. So I'll just start with a brief outline of what I would like to talk about today. So first of all, I'll give a definition on how loneliness and isolation is defined in research, so how we use these terms, and then I'll talk about my research on how a lack of social connection is represented in the brain. And then I'll switch gears a bit and talk about why adolescence is specifically a sensitive period for social development and why we should particularly care about this age group when it comes to loneliness. And I'll then summarize some research on the effects of isolation on adolescent brains. All right. So I'll start with some definitions. So in social psychology, there is this theory that there is a fundamental need to belong in humans. So that means that social interactions in and of themselves are rewarding for people, and they're not just means to receive other rewards. And isolation is defined as the objective state of being alone, while loneliness is defined as the subjective feeling of wanting more social connection than one currently has. So this is important, as it already highlights that this is not the same thing. So being lonely or being isolated is not necessarily a similar state. So in humans, we know that some people can feel lonely even though they are in a crowd. And the other way around as well. So some people are isolated and they're objectively alone, but they're actually fine and they don't feel lonely. So it's important to emphasize that when we speak about loneliness, it's more about the subjective feeling of actually feeling in a state where people are unhappy and want more social contact, rather than the objective experience of just being alone. And there is this theory in social psychology that loneliness is not just an arbitrary emotion, but it's actually a signal. It's a signal that signals to an individual that something is lacking and that it needs to take action to repair what is lacking, just like hunger or thirst would. So hunger would indicate to you that your body does not have enough nutrition and you should eat in order to take care of that. So loneliness is kind of thought to represent a similar signal. So one thing that I've been asking in my research is, well, how is this loneliness signal represented in the brain? If you really think that it's similar to hunger, we should find very similar neural representations. So we directly set up a study to test this question. And more specifically, I'll just briefly walk you through the experiment that I've been doing. So we had participants, 40 participants, who we screened for their social connectedness and their eating behavior. So we invited people who were very social into our labs. And then we asked them to spend one day of food fasting. So for 10 hours, they would not eat any food, but they would be able to socialize as much as they wanted. And then on another day, we asked the same people to come into our lab and then not have any social interaction for the whole day, so for 10 hours. But obviously they could eat during this time. And then we had a third condition where they were just not deprived of anything, and we just scanned them to have a comparison condition, and the order of these conditions was counterbalanced. So after each of these days, participants then went to the MRI scanner and we scanned their brain's activity to see how loneliness and how hunger is represented. And what we also were interested in was the subjective experience of these states. So more specifically, during food fasting and also isolation, we asked participants every 2 hours to give us self-report on how they felt right now. And we asked about their ratings on their hunger. So here I'm showing, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse. I don't think so. Well, I'm showing the rating, so the magnitude of rating of hunger as a over time, so every 2 hours during fasting. And you can see quite nicely that hunger increases the longer people fast, which is kind of what we would expect, right? And then we see a very similar thing for food craving. So this means the subjective experience of wanting food. So the longer people fast, the more they want food. And we also see that people rate themselves as less and less happy the longer they have to fast. So this is also kind of what we would expect. So if hunger is thought to be a negative motivational state, so it's kind of an unpleasant experience that you're trying to get out of. So these are all kind of the ratings that we expected. So then we also looked at how people rated their experiences during social isolation. And what we saw there was that they also rated that their experience of loneliness increased the longer they spent in isolation. And you can see that this the magnitude of this increase is not quite as high as after fasting. So that suggests that we become much more quicker hungry than lonely, which maybe makes sense too. And then we also see a similar increase in wanting social interaction the longer people spend in isolation, and they also report themselves as being less happy over time. So that suggests that in this state of social isolation, our participants here experience this manipulation as a state where they actually experienced loneliness. And as I mentioned in the beginning, this was not necessarily something we were totally sure would happen, because we know that these two states are not necessarily correlated. But in our experiment, we were successful in inducing feelings of loneliness in these participants. So then we specifically looked at one brain region, which is sort of the motivation center of our brain, and it's called the substantia nigra. And I'm showing you here a graph of this brain region, and you can see that it's really small in comparison to the rest of the brain, and it's very kind of deep inside our brain, so it's a very basic brain region. And this brain region controls our motivational states. So whenever we want something, the neurons in this brain region will fire a lot. So we were specifically interested how hunger and loneliness is represented in this brain region. So first of all, when looking at hunger, what we saw was that the brain region showed stronger activation after fasting compared to satiety. So you can see the magnitude of the signal in this graph. And on the left-hand side, you can see the magnitude after fasting, and on the right side, when people were not hungry. And this was the activity in response to seeing food pictures after being fasted. And what we also see is that the activity in this brain region was correlated with self-reported wanting of food. So those people who, after 10 hours of fasting, said, yeah, I really want food right now, they also showed really strong activity in this brain region. While those who were more like, I'm fine, they also showed weaker activity. So this is important because it emphasizes that the activation in this brain region is not just an arbitrary signal, but it's directly related to our experience of wanting something. So the stronger we have activation there, the more someone wants something. So that's good to help us understand motivation. So now we were looking at brain activity during loneliness. And what we saw was that the signal, the pattern of signals was pretty similar. So when people were isolated, this brain region showed stronger activation in response to social images, while when in comparison to when they were connected. So I'm calling this here connection. And what we also see is that there was a correlation, just like with hunger, people who self-reported more that they wanted social contact right now also showed stronger activation in this brain region. Again, signaling that this brain region directly maps onto our subjective wanting of something. So to summarize this study, our results suggest that hunger and loneliness are represented in similar ways in our brains. And this supports the hypothesis that loneliness acts as a signal, just like hunger or thirst, to signal to us that we need to take action to repair what is lacking. Okay, so now I'll shift gears a bit and I'll talk about adolescence and why adolescence specifically is a sensitive period for social development and why loneliness in this age range is particularly problematic. So adolescence is defined in most recent research as a pretty broad age range. It's defined as the age range between 10 to 24 years. So that's kind of well into what most people think is already adulthood, and actually what our legal system thinks is already adulthood. But actually we know from research in cognitive neuroscience that our brains continue to develop well into our 20s. So from the perspective of our brain, we're not quite adults yet, actually. So I'll talk a bit about the structural changes that happen during brain development in adolescents. And in order to do that, I'll just briefly give a bit of background in biology. So essentially, these are, oh, sorry, you don't see my mouse again. So you can see here a neuron, which is the cell that we have in our brains that signals signals. So essentially, activity in a neuron is what underlies our cognition. And it consists of different parts. And the round part that has these little spikes going out of it is the cell body with the dendrites. So dendrites have the synapses that receive information from other neurons. And then you see something that kind of goes away from this neuron, which is called the axon. And that's the structure that signals or that translates signals away from the neuron to other neurons. And importantly, these different structures are aligned in our brains in a specific way, so that the cell bodies and the dendrites are in the outer layer of our brain. So we call this gray matter. And the inner part of our brain consists of these connections. So the axons, and this is called white matter. And this is important to differentiate because these different tissues develop in a different way during actually our whole brain development, but also in adolescence. So what we know from research is that white matter, so the connections between neurons, increases throughout adolescence. So you can see here a graph of volume of this white matter over time, and this is across different studies across the whole world. So this is why you can see these different lines. And we see quite consistently that the white matter increases well into our 20s, and then it kind of levels off and plateaus, and it stays stable. For gray matter, we see sort of the opposite development. So there is a reduction in gray matter over development. So that's already starting kind of in childhood, but then happens quite a lot during adolescence. And again, we see this for different studies across the world. And we see that the gray matter volume of the whole brain decreases by around 1.5% annually in adolescence. And again, well into our 20s. However, if we then look at one specific brain region, which is depicted here, and that's called the prefrontal cortex, we see that the development is even much stronger. So here, the change that occurs throughout adolescence is actually 17%. So the brain changes in this brain region the most. And this is important to know because the prefrontal cortex is the brain region that is responsible for a lot of different types of higher cognition. So for example, whenever we plan something or have a strategy or things like that, but also for social cognition, which actually does require a lot of planning in order to deal with other people. So this is important, and it highlights that adolescence is a time in people's lives where the brain region that is responsible for their social skills, so to say, develops the most. So why is then loneliness so crucial in adolescence? So as I just said, it's a sensitive period for social development. However, something that we have observed now actually across many different countries is that young people, and specifically young people between ages of 16 to 24, so older adolescents, actually report the highest loneliness, and that is in comparison to all other age groups. And people typically think of older people as the most lonely group, but actually it's these adolescents and emerging adults who experience the highest level of loneliness. And this is not something that has always been the case. So these kind of numbers have changed actually quite recently. So you can see on this graph here that so here is the amount of social interactions, so daily social interactions people report with their friends for different age groups over pretty much the last 3 decades. So the first value that was collected was in 1976, and then the last one was 2016. So, and you can see that there is quite a dramatic decrease of how often adolescents report to see their friends every day, and that happened like maybe like 10 years ago. And we see a similar trend now in the opposite direction of self-reported loneliness. So that's not something that's always been the case. It's just happening. It's just something that has happened in the past 10 years. So it's not quite clear why this is the case and what this actually implies or what the results of this development are. However, a lot of people have this hypothesis that actually these increases in loneliness also lead to mental health problems. So we do know that adolescence is a sensitive period also for the onset of mental health problems. So actually 75% of adult mental disorders already begin before 24 years. So, and you can see this in the graph. So you can see the age of onset and for different types of disorders. And it's not for all quite the same, but most of them actually have their onset in adolescence. So it looks like their adolescents do struggle with mental health problems. And some people have suggested that this might be maybe also because of these increases in loneliness. However, what we don't quite know is how loneliness actually affects brain development. So what does it actually directly do to the brains of adolescents that maybe then leads to mental health problems? So one thing that people have looked at in order to study this question was animal models. So we don't really have research on effects of loneliness on adolescent brains using neuroimaging, for example. But what we have is a lot of studies using animal models. And one advantage of animal models is that actually most animals also undergo a period in their life that we could call adolescence. So they show very similar behaviors like human adolescents would. So for example, they are very oriented towards their peers. They will be very reward-seeking and novelty-seeking and show like a variety of different behaviors that are very strongly associated with this specific developmental stage. So this has been then taken to study these animals or the brain development in these animals. For example, rodents or mice mostly actually are a species that has been studied a lot in research on isolation, specifically because mice are also very social animals, and they have this, we know quite well when this developmental stage of adolescence happens. So what researchers have done here was that they have looked at, for one, the effects of short-term isolation. So when they isolate the animal for 24 hours to 1 week, what would happen to their brains? And then others have looked at long-term isolation. So from starting from a week on or longer, and sometimes even through the whole adolescence. So what happens if animals don't have enough social contact during adolescence? So what does happen to their brains? So here I'll just summarize the types of findings that most consistently have been shown across these studies. So in terms of short-term effects, what we see quite a lot is that there is an increased activity in the so-called HPA axis. And the HPA axis is our stress axis, essentially. So whenever we are stressed, this axis gets activated and releases cortisol and adrenaline, and essentially we feel stressed. And so this suggests that not being around peers is a very stressful experience for these adolescent animals. What we also see is that there is an increase in dopamine metabolism. Dopamine is our neurotransmitter that is responsible for our processing of rewards. So when we have a higher dopamine metabolism, so that means that more dopamine is released when we receive a reward. That means that these animals become very sensitive to rewards, and especially social rewards, which makes sense because they were isolated. So then receiving a social reward is very rewarding to them in this stage. However, it has also been shown that this generalizes to other rewards. So these animals, when given the option, would also more often consume substances like alcohol or drugs, for example. However, importantly, in these effects of short-term isolation, reintroduction to social contact mostly reversed these effects. So how does long-term isolation now affect brain development? So here what we see is that the effects are much more profound. So first of all, there seems to be something like a dysregulation of our brain reward system that's happening. And that means that these animals start to become very reward-seeking, and now the focus is not so much on social rewards anymore, but really starts to become very general, and animals start to engage in a very compulsive behavior. So that means that they tend to overeat, they tend to, when given the chance to consume substances, they will very easily become addicted to them. What we also see is that they have a decreased learning. So the dopamine system is not only responsible for motivation, but also for our learning. So these two processes are very tightly connected in our brain. So that means if this reward system is changed in a way that it fires really strongly, what also happens is that these animals will become very inflexible. So whenever there is, they will quite quickly actually learn the association between a reward and something else. But when that changes, they will be really bad at changing something or learning something new. In addition, what we also see is that there are changes in the serotonin system. And serotonin is the neurotransmitter that underlies our emotional well-being. And this goes along with increased anxiety, fear, and stress reactivity in these animals. So they will become very easily stressed and very easily anxious. And thirdly, one thing that I find particularly kind of an astonishing finding is that what we also see is a reduction in synaptic pruning. And synaptic pruning, that is actually the process that underlies this decrease in gray matter that I showed earlier. So the reduction in this gray matter is what actually happens is that synapses that are not used are pruned away, so they're eliminated. So that means that our brain kind of very selectively only keeps those synapses that are important for a specific environment, but will reduce those that are not important. And that's a very important brain development. It kind of specializes our brain. However, this seems to not quite happen when animals are isolated. And that affects quite a broad range of executive function. So that means all these higher cognitive processes that we have, like planning or cognitive control. And for this specific finding, what I found particularly astonishing was that the reduction in synaptic pruning actually occurred in animals when they were not just totally isolated, but when they were raised with only adult animals. So that means it was not just the social contact, it was specifically the social contact with peers that was required in order to kind of guarantee this normal and healthy brain development, which I think is quite an important finding. And also importantly, what these studies unfortunately have found is that reintroduction to social contact does not reverse most of these effects. So if isolation occurs for really long, the changes that occur are often then not reversed after resocialization. So one remaining open question, and I'm actually at the end now, is, well, how and to what extent can we translate these findings to humans? And I'm sure a lot of you probably have thought this already while I was speaking about this. Well, the rodent social world looks quite different to the social world of humans. So is it really possible to directly say, well, if this happens to the rodent brain, that's also what we could expect to happen in humans? And that's one question I'm specifically interested in and that we are now working or I'm working on in my research. So just to briefly summarize what I've been talking about today. So first of all, loneliness can be seen as a motivational signal to repair what is lacking, like hunger. And loneliness and hunger have similar representations in the brain. Adolescence is a sensitive period of social development and specifically social brain development. However, adolescents experience is the brain or age range where people experience high loneliness. And in addition, animal models on isolation in adolescents suggest that there are severe effects of isolation on brain development. All right. So thank you all for listening. And here are just some pictures of people who have worked with me and who I'm very grateful for their help in my work. Thank you all. So I'm going to stop sharing now. Oh, I don't hear you, Dawn.
Darn it, I was hoping we wouldn't have to say, are you muted in this program? Thank you very much for sharing your research. That is pretty profound to think that the contacts with your peers are really instrumental in some of this brain development. And so having the pandemic would just be so detrimental to that. So thank you. Thank you very much for sharing. We're going to move on to our second speaker, who is local and will be able to offer some tips on coping with stress. And so Ornella Razetto has both a BSW and an MSW degrees and is a licensed clinical social worker. In her current role at Community Health, she is both an administrator of program and a direct service provider. Her areas of expertise and interest include cultural perceptions of mental illness within the Latin American community, major depressive disorders and anxiety disorders amongst foreign-born Latin Americans in the United States, and resiliency among Latina survivors of domestic violence. We'll turn it over to you, Ms. Razetto.
Thank you so much. If you can just do a little note that you all can hear me. And I just like to begin by giving a little bit of background, with the focus of what I will be presenting. It's going to be a little bit of, what exactly is contributing to these factors, and then along with it, of course, the, coping skills and strategies. And because we are living in these COVIDian times, it is very much specific to how we are managing this in the pandemic. And as a clinician, I want to also just speak to some of the things that I've been noticing, as I know that my colleagues have as well, as we continue to live during these pandemic times, are just where the baseline is and happens to be around mental health and mental health disorders in general, which of course has very much into loneliness and isolation. So one is, people who were with established, for example, mental health disorders, and with treatment, we're seeing treatment having to be upped or modified because whatever was being utilized is simply not enough, because of just everything that's happening and how these additional triggers in these times are just making their management of symptoms worse. Also, folks who were not with any type of treatment, at least medicated treatment, are seeking appointments with their doctors and specialty providers to begin treatment, recognizing that everything that's happening is too much to be managed without medications. And thirdly, and honestly, possibly most concerning to me, is folks with semi-severe mental health disorders who have gotten COVID and what their recovery looks like, with particular jumps of fairly severe symptoms, which can last for months thereafter. And I say all of this just because we are all living in these very stressed times. And if going into this pandemic, you were someone that already was having difficulties managing stress and anxiety, chronic stress at that, depressive symptoms, loneliness, isolation, this has further compounded it, in addition to folks who would have said, I'm doing okay, I'm managing things, well enough on my own, going into this are now unfortunately sharing in that same space as their other counterparts. And, when we think of loneliness, isolation, sadness, stress, anxiety, I very often hear, as folks are thinking of changes to take on things they want to do, of just oftentimes wanting to wait for that one day when they feel better, when they feel motivated, and they'll do whatever it is they're planning to do that day. Unfortunately, that day doesn't come. Like, the reality is that day does not just come, that day is created, right? You bring upon that day, and you do so by incremental changes to what you wanted to get, where you want to go. So if, for example, it's, I want to be out and be with my friends and feel good with my friends outside, or simply be comfortable outside, that first step may not even be outside, but just, for example, being comfortable going to the door. Because the day when I'm just comfortable going to the door, again, those days don't just come, we create those days. And oftentimes I know that that's the impediment, where we are hoping we'll just feel good enough one day to then do those things, but it's actually the opposite of what we can do to get that day to come, that we can then, begin to build more off of. And if we think about specifically isolation, unfortunately, one of the problems that happens, the more you are isolated, even if there was a desire to not be isolated and to go out and to be with people, which for many reasons we cannot right now as we would have before, the anxiety and stress comes in and begins to prolong that factor by, over time, having people become very anxious about leaving the home. I've had, unfortunately, many patients who, over time, the more time they spent at home, they became more fearful and worrisome to leave the house. Like, even just going to the door, knowing they have to go outside, or getting panic attacks upon being outside, something they never had before. And all of this created by that prolonged isolation. And if I had to say what factors, I would say for loneliness, isolation, depression, anxiety, all of these stressors would be just general coping skills that I recommend, and I will be touching on them, would be just improved sleep and sleep hygiene and regimen, self-care and being outside more, which can possibly be in the same bucket, and having some type of routine or structured schedule. So I'll talk about, with isolation and stress and all of this first, around just being in home or being indoors a lot. And, Dr. Tomova can possibly speak to this when we do our Q&As as well. When we think of the type of stimulation that we have, or rather the lack thereof, in home versus the type of stimulation that we have when we're outside, I mean, you truly see the discrepancies, right? You're outside, you see people walking, you see cars, you see dogs, you have to maybe take a detour with where you want to go. We're constantly being bombarded with all of this stimulation and having to think of new things to do, things to say, what have you. At home, oftentimes it's very lacking in stimulation, right? There's nothing new, there's not really novel things to do or see at home, other than perhaps things that are very much screen-based, computers, laptops, phones, those sorts of things. And this lack of stimulation, you see how that affects our mood, how that affects simply how we feel. And the lack of this external stimulation of engaging with people, having to do things you wouldn't otherwise do, the longer that goes and continues on, I mean, we know and we've seen how that affects the brain. And this really, unfortunately, presents itself with the more that, for example, folks are having to be isolated at home, right? How do we duplicate that level of stimulation at home? Or how can we replace some of that stimulation, which speaks to how can folks creatively engage with other people or activities at home? Which, of course, there can be many things to this. I know a lot of folks in recent times are, well, how can I remain connected to my friends and my family via the social medias and whatnot, which, is a fair and healthy choice and option for many. But also, I feel this is a novel time to begin just thinking outside of that circle of support, and how can I create new connections, new interests, new potentials. Even, for example, when folks are thinking, well, what can I do remotely? What can I do at home? What can I do without leaving where I am? I think of, for example, volunteer remote activities, right? It's something free, something you can do on your own time, interpreting, transcribing documents, right? There are things that are novel, new, that can connect you to other people that can be done at home to help with something that is both stimulating, but also engaging with, the outside world. And on that piece of, isolation and being at home, oftentimes comes just the lack of physical activity. And we know very well just how detrimental it is for the body and the brain, right? To just not regularly not engaging regularly in activity. I mean, unfortunately, I would say there are so many groups in our bodies that are suffering from folks, all of us, I include myself in this as well, having to spend too much time inside, doing not enough as we can or we'd like to inside. And you really see that with just our levels of physical activity, and how that, though we may put that to the side and put that away, is something that our body does not forget. And when our body doesn't forget, our mind doesn't forget either. And that level of isolation, of being at home, not really moving much because we're at home, if we're not getting us, outside and whatnot, the body takes notice. And when the body takes notice of these things and the mind takes notice, it oftentimes represents in what we call psychosomatic symptoms, headaches, stomach aches, body aches, insomnia, these things where your brain is trying to tell you something, but it doesn't tell you directly, right? It tells you indirectly. And as things have gotten better, I always, 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 always try to encourage folks to just leave the house, just period. Doesn't matter where you got to go, what you got to do, how far you're outside for, but just to leave the house, and hopefully leave the house on a regular basis, to one, not get accustomed to that isolation, two, not build up anxiety and fear from being so much, spending so much time at home, but also just like physically to encourage that activity so that, your body's doing good, your brain's doing good, all of you is doing well as a whole. And, with that, I would also say, as far as, the things that we are doing at home, and also hopefully perhaps walking out, one thing that I encourage everyone, and something that I sometimes struggle with, but I try to stick to it as much as possible, is to find a way to schedule a healthy, varied routine for yourself as much as is possible. I know that in these times, it's very easy to put something off to the next day, but when your Mondays are like your Wednesdays, are like your Fridays, are like your Sundays, and when we really can't attribute things to particular days, and more importantly, when we don't give ourselves things to look forward to, like honestly, that's just simply like our downer, right? For our brains, like what am I looking forward to do? The same thing the next day, and the week thereafter, and the month thereafter. And the lack of routine and schedule creates for us this open schedule where we'll always get to something sometime, but that sometime doesn't come because we just keep postponing those times. And I feel that being fair to ourselves and scheduling, like literally like breakfast time, lunch time, go outside time, work on this time, and if possible, new activities remotely or outside, if possible, into that, and having it be varied. Because again, you want that variety, right? That spice of life. You don't want the same old, because again, you want a little bit of stimulation also with what you're doing with your weekly and daily activities. And as far as what you could also add to something of this sort around scheduling something for yourself and creating a routine, which I will say, particularly with depressive symptoms, it becomes more and more difficult to do, which again is why, back to that idea of creating that day for yourself when you will feel better and feel good. It's this idea of, these are the things that I need to begin working on to make that happen, to make sure that I'm able to keep any depressive symptoms and thoughts and feelings of loneliness and all of those other things at bay as much as possible, right? So with creating a routine, I also highly encourage particular activities that simply help foment and increase, what I would call, like self-care. And oftentimes that really does boil down to things that are just what you do for yourself that makes you feel good. with the focus of it is for yourself and for no one else. And especially good if it's very much, relaxation based. So for example, things like daily meditation or some type of ritual of gratitude of like, this is what I'm doing for myself. This is what I'm hoping to do. This is what I'm working on, is just a simple reminder of the things that you have been doing, look forward to do, to just give you that little pep talk reminder for yourself. Along with that could be just daily meditative practices, deep breathing. Some people I know are very much into like any type of calming sounds or music. I feel that type of self-care is so often ignored. When we're growing up, it's not really a main focus. And as we grow older, we oftentimes don't have the time, and it's difficult to make the time. But when you incorporate into your daily schedule as part of your healthy habits, like you would brushing your teeth or taking your medications or what have you, when you give it that credence of, I need to do this as part of my overall well-being upkeep, right? We kind of boast it up to this piece of like, well, this is just what we all should be doing to be well, period. Also, with specific to stress and anxiety and combating feelings of loneliness and just any worries along with that, with more relaxation-based practices, would definitely, my personal favorite, could be yours as well perhaps, would be what we call visualization or guided imagery. And there are tons of videos on YouTube about this. I am fanatical about free resources. So again, visualization or guided imagery videos on YouTube. Along with that, I would highly recommend progressive muscle relaxation. Again, that's progressive muscle relaxation, which focuses on how our body becomes physically tense as we are stressed and worried. And back to that mind and body connection, right? Automatically, instinctively, as we become worried and stressed and anxious, so does our body. And through the exercises with progressive muscle relaxation, you are teaching yourself to better recognize how your body becomes tense so that you can better relax your body. Because if you don't feel well, if you feel in pain or you're feeling achy, well, now you're going to be conscious of that and then worried about that. And that cycle is going to continue on. And I'd also just, again, like to put in a little plug to, if you're thinking about things with which to stay connected, remain engaged, be stimulated in new things, I really can't plug enough this idea of volunteering remotely. I myself work at a free clinic that is volunteer run. We would be nothing without our volunteers. And I'm not saying this because I'm plugging our clinic, but I know that there are so many places that are in need of volunteers and with remote work. And I feel that, doing good for yourself while also doing good for others, I feel is such a continued like flow of just like feel good vibes for folks. So I really would encourage, if you haven't looked into that, as another opportunity with which to, again, remain engaged, connected, and stimulated during these difficult times. And I will go ahead and turn it back to Dawn for our Q&A.
Thank you so much, ladies, for sharing your expertise, not only on the research in regard to loneliness, but what we can do to manage this stress. And I'm really interested in hearing how you express that it might manifest itself in physical ways. We do, Ornella, have a question that asked if how much of an effect does diet have on mental health? And so I'm going to start off by asking you that question.
I mean, I feel that diet is important, not so much the foods that we eat, which of course are important, this idea of, fruits and veggies and all of those things are delicious and wonderful for you versus, cheeseburgers and pizza chips, not so much. But I feel it has really more to do with the intention of your diet, right? If you're being or having intention of, I want to take care of myself and eat well, like that is a really, really good starting point. Like dieting for the purposes of feeling good, feeling better, feeling healthy. And conversely, when we're not able to do those things, right? For example, this idea of emotional overeating, when we're very stressed and worried, we tend to eat things that physically are not necessarily what we'd call healthy, but it's more things that are salty or very sweet, which our doctors probably would not be very happy with. But there is this tendency to consume things that are not physically healthy for us, but our brain really wants to have, especially like sugary things and whatnot. But I feel that if it's being done with health in mind, dieting is a great thing to have. But also, dieting goes hand in hand also with like your structure of the day, eating at healthy times, eating meals that give you the energy to sustain what you want to do. To me, diet as part of physical health goes hand in hand with mental health. I never envision a world where those two things are separate. And I still wish more of us thought of them, as one and the other, because, you can't be physically well. You can't be physically unwell and then just mentally fantastic, right? It has to be a balance of both things, and being conscious with the moments when you're eating in a way that you'd recognize as unhealthy. It perhaps isn't you necessarily wanting to chow down on like hot dogs and whatnot, if that's what you like to do. But it could just be perhaps stress or worry, and also the quick reward that we get when we eat something that we like, right? It's probably the quickest reward you can create for yourself. I am hungry, let me eat some cookies. It's very rare to get that kind of quick reward and satisfaction from other facets of life.
Oh, thank you so much for answering that question. I do want to address that we have had some issues with our closed captioning, and we are working on that on both YouTube and Facebook. So we apologize for the inconvenience, and we are working to make them available. So, Livia, I'm going to ask you this question in regards to the results from the research you presented. What were some of the specifics of the people in this study, like age-wise, race and gender, social status, and also were these studies conducted prior to the pandemic or during the pandemic?
Yeah, thanks. Those are really good questions and important, of course. So the studies were conducted before the pandemic. So all of our participants were scanned before any of this happened. It was kind of an odd coincidence that we actually finished our paper right when the pandemic started, which was kind of a bizarre thing to have at the moment. But in terms of the characteristics of our sample, we were trying really hard to make it more or less characteristic. In a way, characteristic, that it would represent different kinds of people. And that's kind of difficult if you're running fMRI studies, because it has a lot of exclusion criteria. And the kinds of participants you end up with typically are undergrads. And I was doing a study while I was at MIT, so the standard MIT undergrad is maybe not super representative. So we tried really hard to have people that were not necessarily students in our study. So we recruited a lot outside of the university and tried to have people who were older, who had kids, who had jobs, come in. And we managed in the end to have about half of our participants not being students, and we were actually quite happy about that. But in terms of age, we had mostly younger people. So there were not that many, I would say a lot of them were still undergrads, but we did not actually find age effects. So in our study, even though I would expect that adolescents, specifically younger adolescents, would be more sensitive to experiences of loneliness, in our study, in this age range that we looked at, which was 18 to 40 years, we did not see a correlation with age. What we did see, though, was that there was an effect of how people responded to our experiment, depending on their already existing loneliness. So that was really interesting, and we did not necessarily predict it. What we found was that because we collected measures of self-reported loneliness before people came into our lab, so we knew from each person like how much they self-reported to be lonely. And what we found was that those people who self-reported to be more lonely showed lower activation in the brain region after isolation when they saw pictures of social contact. And they also self-reported to want less social contact. So that's kind of interesting, especially because we found something else in addition, which was that those people who reported to be more lonely also showed a decreased activation to food pictures after fasting, and also lower self-reports of wanting food. So that's kind of interesting, because initially we thought it's, well, maybe if you're really lonely for a longer while, you just might care less if you spend time alone. But actually, our data suggested that maybe there's something more general going on in the motivation system, that those people maybe seem to have a reduced kind of drive to obtain these kinds of natural rewards after being deprived of them. And it's difficult to really interpret these results, because these are correlational findings. So we don't know what effect drives what. So it could be that because those people were more lonely, their activity in their brain's reward system decreased, and that's maybe a cause of loneliness. But it could also be the other way around. So it could be that those people who, for whatever reason, have somehow less responsive brain reward systems end up as those who are in the end more lonely. So maybe there's this connection. We don't quite know. And that's also something that I'm trying to look into more right now.
A fair answer. It was a exploratory introductory study with a sizable sample, and we'd like to repeat that. Ladies, I'm going to ask you a question that was posed, and I think it'd be interesting to hear the answer from both of you. So would you say, given the research you presented, Livia, and what you're seeing, Ornella, are adolescents suffering more than adults during COVID and during the pandemic? And we'll start with you, Ornella.
I personally don't work directly with adolescents, although most of my patients have children and many of them are adolescents. And what I will say is across the board, all of them are reporting on behalf of their children isolation and depressive symptoms. And I will say particularly distressing are those cases where children are also with or in need of special needs services, because it is doubly difficult for parents to help fill those gaps of having their children engage with other children, other adolescents, because it simply is not an option, although this group was prioritized, at least here in the city of Chicago, as far as engaging. So I will say that I have seen these rates, although interestingly, I have seen the correlation of people who are more financially responsible, like paying rent, paying the bills, are oftentimes more stressed and anxious and worried than whoever in the home is not in charge of that. So I'm seeing, for example, which would be children and seniors, for example, are more depressed, feeling more lonely, feeling more isolated. And then the income earners in the home feeling more stress and reporting much more anxiety-based symptoms than their counterparts.
And Livia, what would you say in regard to the research side of the brainwaves and the neurons?
Yeah, I was now super curious to hear what Ornella would be saying, because that's something we have this theory that adolescents might be more affected by current social distancing measures, but it's not necessarily something that has been investigated much yet. I mean, there are some preliminary findings from questionnaire studies that have suggested that might be the case, but it's still not very conclusive. But our reasoning was that because adolescence is such an important period in your life for social development, and specifically the social interaction with peers is such a crucial element of this, there might be this, or the assumption would be that having not access to your peers, spending a lot of time at home and not with the friends that you usually would want to spend your time with, that could have really severe effects on brain development. So even though these adolescents might not be as isolated as someone in an experiment would be, or particularly in these animal studies, there still might be something that's really lacking, but actually really important for their development. But again, this is not something where we actually have data on yet. It's just this is a hypothesis based on studies that exist already, and what we would expect in terms of what we know about adolescent development and what is important for this sensitive period, that we kind of expect that this kind of situation right now might be actually quite problematic. But one thing I should add is that that we do have social media, and Ornella was touched upon this a bit, that people do connect over social media, and some people are kind of very negative about that, but I don't think necessarily that's a bad thing. Actually, quite the opposite. And some research does suggest that if you use social media in a way that is active and where you actively seek social interactions with others, it might be actually really helpful. So this is one option why potentially this social distancing could even be not as bad for adolescents, because they still are able to connect with their friends over social media. So it might actually be that they are able to compensate a lot with these kinds of interactions.
Okay, and I know, Ornella, you wanted to add something anecdotal to what Livia had said.
Yes, bouncing off of what Livia just shared, anecdotally, I will say 100% of the time of my patients that I see, again, whom are all adults, who state that they don't have friends, they don't believe in having friends because people are bad and other sorts of things, it never fails that they believe this because of negative friendships or social interactions they had as adolescents. And I say this because what happened in adolescence and the experience that they had then continued to influence every year thereafter, leading to this perception of I can't have friends, and so they don't have friends and they don't engage and they don't socialize. And lo and behold, become isolated, feel loneliness because of these early experiences. So I really give so much credence to what Olivia was saying.
Goodness, it's already 2 minutes to the hour. I am so very sorry that we did not get to all of the questions, and the questions are asked so that we can address both of the speakers. And there are more questions. I'm sorry we've run out of time, ladies. What I can share is that C2ST is working on a blog post to share additional resources that will include media that are online and articles you can read and numbers you can call. So we are aware of the importance of sharing resources with our audience. And Dr. Tomova, we're very grateful that you were able to join us despite the time change and being on different continents. And Ornella, thank you so much for joining us and giving us some of those practical insights. And if you've been carrying things for a long time and you're feeling overwhelmed, give yourself a break and give yourself some time. It's really important to stop and breathe sometime. And we will continue to offer programs for mental wellness. Next week, we will have a program where we're speaking with some researchers directly focused on youth. If you would like to donate to C2ST or learn more and perhaps sign up for our newsletter to learn about all of the programs coming up in the next few months, go to c2st.org. And again, we know your time is valuable and we are grateful that you joined us today. Have a great afternoon.